And John loved Colorado. It changed his life. He had the ability to put into words, I think, things that we all felt.
A small-town girl from Minnesota meets a struggling musician with big dreams and an even bigger heart. Their love story would inspire some of the most beautiful songs ever written, break hearts around the world, and leave behind mysteries that fans have wondered about for decades. Today, we're going to talk about Annie Denver, the woman who captured John Denver's heart and inspired his greatest hits, and what she's revealed about their life together after all these years. If you've ever listened to Annie's song and felt your heart skip a beat, if you've ever wondered what happened to real Annie after John Denver's tragic death, then you're in for an emotional journey. Because the story of Annie and John Denver isn't just about fame and music. It's about love, loss, family, and the strength it takes to rebuild your life when the whole world is watching. Let's start from the beginning, because every great love story deserves to be told from the start. It was 1966, and Annie Martel was just a regular college student at Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota. She was studying to become a teacher, living a quiet life far from the spotlight. She had no idea that her life was about to change forever when she met a young man named Henry John Deutschendorf Jr. You probably know him better as John Denver. John wasn't famous yet. He was just a guy with a guitar, trying to make it in the music world. But there was something special about him that caught Annie's attention. Maybe it was his gentle spirit, or the way his eyes lit up when he talked about music. Whatever it was, Annie saw something in John that others might have missed. She believed in him when he was nobody, and that kind of faith would become the foundation of their relationship. Their courtship was like something out of a fairy tale. John would write songs for Annie, serenading her with melodies that came straight from his heart. He wasn't rich or famous, but he gave her something more precious than money could ever buy. He gave her his complete devotion. Annie later said that those early days were some of the happiest of her life. They were young in love, and the whole world felt like it was full of endless possibilities. In 1967, John and Annie took a trip that would change everything. They went to the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, and John fell completely in love with the landscape. The mountains, the clear blue skies, the endless horizons. It all spoke to something deep in his soul. It was during this trip that John wrote one of his most famous songs, Rocky Mountain High. But more importantly, it was where he realized he wanted to spend the rest of his life, not just in Colorado, but with Annie by his side. They got married on June 9, 1967, in a simple ceremony that reflected their down-to-earth values. Annie wasn't marrying a celebrity. She was marrying a man she loved, who just happened to have big dreams about making music. At that time, John was still struggling to make it in the music industry. Money was tight, and the future was uncertain. But Annie stood by him through it all. She worked to support them while John focused on his music career, never once complaining about the sacrifices she was making. Then, in 1974, something magical happened. John had been working on a new song, something special that he wanted to dedicate to Annie. He had been thinking about their relationship, about how much she meant to him, and about all the moments they had shared together. The result was Annie's song, one of the most beautiful love songs ever written. When John first played it for Annie, she cried. The lyrics were so personal, so intimate, that it felt like John had reached into his heart and pulled out his deepest feelings for the whole world to hear. You fill up my senses like a night in a forest, like the mountains in springtime, like a walk in the rain. John sang, and millions of people around the world fell in love with not just a song, but with the love story behind it. Annie's song became a huge hit, reaching #1 on the charts and making John Denver a household name. But for Annie, it was more than just a successful song. It was a public declaration of her husband's love. The success of Annie's song changed everything for John and Annie. Suddenly, John was in demand everywhere. Record companies wanted to sign him. Concert venues wanted to book him. And fans wanted to know everything about the woman who had inspired such a beautiful song. Annie found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never asked for and wasn't entirely comfortable with. Fame brought many wonderful things to their lives. They could afford a beautiful home in Aspen, Colorado, surrounded by the mountains that John loved so much. They could travel the world, meet interesting people, and experience things they had only dreamed about. But fame also brought challenges that tested their relationship in ways they had never expected. John's career demanded more and more of his time. He was constantly touring, recording, and promoting his music. Meanwhile, Annie was left at home, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy in their lives. She had always been a private person, and the constant attention from fans and media was overwhelming. She never wanted to be famous. She just wanted to be John's wife and to build a life together. As the years went by, John and Annie faced a heartbreak that many couples experience but rarely talk about publicly. They desperately wanted children, but Annie struggled with fertility issues. For a couple so deeply in love, the inability to have biological children was devastating. They tried for years, going through treatments and holding on to hope, but it just wasn't meant to be. However, John and Annie's love for each other and their desire to be parents led them down a different path. They decided to adopt, and in 1974, they welcomed their daughter Anna Kate into their family. 2 years later, they adopted their son Zachary. Annie later said that becoming a mother was one of the greatest joys of her life, and that her children brought a happiness she had never known before. John wrote songs about his children too, celebrating the joy they brought to his and Annie's lives. Zachary and Jennifer was inspired by his son and his dreams for his future. Annie found her purpose in motherhood, pouring all of her love and energy into raising their children while John continued his music career. But even with the joy of their children, the pressures of fame continued to strain John and Annie's marriage. John's drinking became more frequent, often as a way to cope with the stress of his career and the demands of being in the public eye. Annie watched the man she loved struggle with demons that success had brought into their lives. She tried to help him, to be supportive, but addiction is a disease that affects entire families. The couple also faced financial stress, despite John's success. The music industry can be unpredictable, and John made some poor business decisions that put their financial security at risk. Annie, who had always been practical and level-headed, found herself worrying about their future in ways she had never expected when they were young and struggling but happy. By the early 1980s, it became clear that John and Annie's marriage was in serious trouble. They had grown apart, despite their love for each other and their children. The man who had once written the most beautiful love song for Annie was now distant, struggling with his own personal battles. Annie found herself feeling lonely even when John was home, and she realized that they had become strangers living under the same roof. The decision to divorce wasn't easy for either of them. They had been together for 15 years, had built a life together, and had 2 children who depended on them. But Annie knew that staying in an unhappy marriage wouldn't be good for anyone, especially their kids. In 1982, John and Annie officially divorced, and in one of the most famous love stories in music history. The divorce was difficult for both John and Annie, but they were determined to remain friends for the sake of their children. Unlike many celebrity divorces that turn ugly and public, John and Annie handled their separation with grace and dignity. They continued to co-parent Anna Kate and Zachary, making sure that their children felt loved and supported by both parents. Annie made the decision to stay in Aspen after the divorce. Colorado had become her home too, and she wanted to maintain stability for her children. She largely stepped away from the public eye, focusing on raising Anna Kate and Zachary and building a life for herself outside of John's shadow. This wasn't easy. Everywhere she went, people knew her as the Annie from the song, but she was determined to forge her own identity. John, meanwhile, continued his music career, but never quite recaptured the magic of his earlier years. He married again to Australian actress Cassandra Delaney and had another daughter, Jessie Bell. But his personal struggles continued, and his relationship with Cassandra was also troubled. Despite their divorce, John and Annie maintained a special bond. They had shared too much history, too much love, and too many important moments to simply become strangers. John would often call Annie for advice, and she remained one of the few people who could reach him when he was struggling. Their children remember their parents always speaking respectfully about each other, never using them as weapons in any ongoing conflict. Then came October 12, 1997, a date that changed everything. John Denver was piloting his experimental Rutan Long-EZ aircraft when it crashed into Monterey Bay in California. He was killed instantly at the age of 53. The music world lost a legend, but Annie lost something much more personal. She lost a man who had been the love of her life, the father of her children, and her closest friend for over 30 years. Annie was devastated by John's death. Despite their divorce, she had never stopped loving him, and she had always held on to hope that someday they might find their way back to each other. Now that possibility was gone forever. She had to not only deal with her own grief, but also help her children process the loss of their father. The period after John's death was incredibly difficult for Annie. She was thrust back into the spotlight as the media wanted to know how the real Annie was coping with the loss. Fans from around the world reached out to her, sharing their own memories of how John's music had touched their lives. While she appreciated the support, Annie remained largely private about her grief, dealing with her loss in her own way. What many people don't know is how Annie honored John's memory in the years after his death. She became involved in several charitable causes that were important to John, including environmental conservation and wildlife protection. She established scholarships in John's name and worked to preserve his musical legacy. But she did all of this quietly, without seeking attention or credit. Annie also had to deal with complex legal issues surrounding John's estate. Because John died without a will, there were complications about how his assets would be distributed. Annie had to fight to ensure that their children received their fair share of their father's legacy. This legal battle was painful and drawn out, but Annie was determined to protect her children's inheritance. In the years following John's death, Annie largely disappeared from public view. She focused on her children, her charitable work, and building a quiet life in Aspen. Anna Kate and Zachary grew up to be successful adults. Anna Kate became involved in sustainable agriculture, while Zachary pursued a career in politics and environmental activism. Annie could be proud of the fact that despite the challenges they had faced, she had raised 2 children who were making positive contributions to the world. As Annie entered her 70s, people began to wonder what had become the woman who had inspired one of the most beloved songs in American music. Occasionally, there would be sightings of her in Aspen, but she remained committed to her privacy. She had no interest in writing tell-all books or giving explosive interviews about her life with John Denver. However, in recent years, as Annie has reached her late 70s, she has begun to open up a bit more about her life and her relationship with John. Not through sensational media interviews, but through carefully chosen conversations with trusted friends and journalists who respect her privacy. What she has shared has given fans new insight into the real story behind the music and the myths. One of the things Annie has confirmed is something that many fans had suspected but never knew for sure, that John never stopped loving her, even after their divorce. She has revealed that John called her regularly, that he often expressed regret about how their marriage had ended, and that he had hoped they might someday reconcile. This revelation has been both heartbreaking and healing for fans who had always wondered if the love story behind Annie's song had truly ended with their divorce. Annie has also spoken about the reality of being married to someone with addiction issues. She has been honest about how difficult it was to watch John struggle with alcohol and how it affected their entire family. But she has also emphasized that John's struggles with addiction didn't diminish the love they shared or the good man he was at heart. Perhaps most importantly, Annie has confirmed that despite everything they went through, the divorce, the years apart, the pain and the heartbreak, she never regretted falling in love with John Denver. She has said that their love story, while not perfect, was real and beautiful and worth every moment of joy and pain it brought into her life. At 78, Annie Denver is a woman who has lived through incredible highs and devastating lows. She has been the inspiration for one of the most beautiful love songs ever written, the wife of one of America's most beloved musicians, and the mother of 2 successful children. She has dealt with divorce, loss, and grief with dignity and grace. She has managed to maintain her privacy and integrity in a world that constantly demands more access, more information, and more drama. Today, Annie continues to live quietly in Colorado, surrounded by the mountains that she and John both loved. She stays involved with her charitable work and remains close to her children and grandchildren. She has chosen to let John's music speak for their love story, rather than writing books or giving interviews that might exploit their relationship for profit. The rumor that many fans have wondered about over the years, whether Annie and John ever considered getting back together, has been confirmed by Annie herself. They did talk about it, They did consider it, and there was always love between them. But sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the challenges that life throws at you. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone go, even when it breaks your heart. Annie's story is ultimately one of resilience, love, and quiet strength. She has shown that it's possible to live with grace and dignity, even when your private life becomes public property. She has demonstrated that real love doesn't always have fairy tale endings, but that doesn't make it any less real or any less beautiful. For those of us who have listened to Annie's song and wonder about the woman behind it, Annie Denver's life story is both heartbreaking and inspiring. She reminds us that behind every great song is a real person with real feelings, real struggles, and real triumphs. She shows us that love can survive divorce, that friendship can endure beyond marriage, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply letting someone know that they were loved completely and truly, even if it wasn't forever. The next time you hear Annie's song, remember that it wasn't just a hit record. It was a man's way of telling the world how much he loved his wife. And remember that the woman who inspired it is still here, still living with grace and dignity, still carrying that love in her heart after all these years. Annie Denver may be 78 years old, but her story and her love story with John Denver continues to touch hearts and inspire people around the world. In a world where celebrity relationships often seem shallow and temporary, the story of John and Annie Denver reminds us what real love looks like. It's not perfect. It doesn't always last forever, but when it's real, it creates something beautiful that can never be destroyed. Even after divorce, even after death, even after decades of separation, the love between John and Annie Denver lives on in the music they created together and in the family they built together. Annie Denver has confirmed the most important rumor of all, that their love was real, that it was deep, and that it changed both of their lives forever. And really, isn't that what we all hope for in love? Not perfection, not a fairy tale ending, but something real and true and beautiful that makes our lives richer for having experienced it. That's the legacy of Annie and John Denver. Not just the music, not just the fame, but a reminder that love, even when it's complicated and difficult and doesn't end the way we hoped, is still the most powerful force in the world. And sometimes the greatest gift we can give to someone we love is the freedom to be themselves, even if it means letting them go. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need to hear about the power of real, lasting love. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about the real people behind the music we love, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Because everyone has a story worth telling, and everyone deserves to have their love story remembered with the respect and dignity it deserves. Thank you for watching, and remember, love is always worth it, even when it hurts.